Okay, there we go. Oh, it started. Hey guys, so last week we talked about ethical culture at a business. What features of the culture at a business uh, promote or discourage good or bad behavior? So, we talked about all the formal systems that, according to Trevino and Nelson, make up the ethical culture of a business. Its authority structure, its executive leadership, its performance management system. So the way they make decisions about hiring and promotion and so on, compensation, the rules that are on the books. We also talked about the informal systems that make up the culture at a business. What are the norms, the sort of expectations about how people are going to act? How do people talk? Do they talk about values? Do they only talk about profit? What are the stories which get passed around? Who are the people that you look up to if you work at the business? Okay, so last week we talked about ethical culture, but I thought this week it would be a good idea to look in detail at a couple of concrete examples of companies. One company which, in a lot of respects, gets ethical culture right, at least as far as I can tell, and one company which gets its ethical culture really disastrously wrong. And so hopefully this whole sort of discussion of culture will get a little bit more concrete. And also in talking about these particular cases, maybe you can get a little bit of practice for the second and third assignments that make up your own ethical culture projects. Okay, so first let's talk about Patagonia. So Patagonia is a kind of high-end retail clothing and outdoor gear business. Um, their at least their core business initially was selling climbing gear, but now it's Patagonia is sort of a status symbol. It's a among a certain group of people. This is a very prestigious type of clothing to wear. So Patagonia gets a lot right. So they are known for their environmental activism. So they're known for donating 1% of their annual profits to environmental charities. The article that you read was about an initiative to give workers paid time off, 2 months of paid time off, to work with uh, uh, different charities. And the sort of founder of the business, he's no longer the CEO, but Yvon Chouinard is known as as an environmental activist, and is very outspoken about environmental issues. So, okay, so one thing that they get right is, Patagonia has done, at least to the extent that these charities are effective, has done some good work for the environment. Patagonia is also known for their labor practices. So they were early, at least in the United States, to provide, like back in the 80s, to provide on-site childcare for workers. So, it's clearly and they've had a maternity leave policy, which is, of course, not mandated by federal law. We don't have any federal maternity leave guarantee in the United States, but they have a by U.S. standards, very generous maternity, I should say, parental leave policy. It's not just for moms. It's for dads too, and it's sort of generally known as or considered to be a nice place to work. So I think they stand out from some of their competitors, from people who sell other athletic gears, for their clean supply chain. So they are careful to source to source materials for their clothing from places with decent environmental practices and decent animal treatment practices, and so on. So one thing which is worth considering here is that they've also shown themselves in the past to be responsive to criticism in a pretty healthy way. So there was an investigation into where they were sourcing their cotton. I think it was back in the 90s. And they discovered that there were serious environmental costs to the type of cotton they were putting into their clothes, and so they opted for a lower environmental cost organic cotton from then on out. There have been in recent years some criticisms of they use wool, and so there have been some criticisms of their suppliers' practices with respect to sheep. So you get wool from sheep, and often the process of harvesting wool from sheep is a very bloody one. So sheep can be cut open or maimed or dismembered in the process of gathering their wool. And Patagonia has been, in more recent years, pretty responsive to those criticisms, has taken those criticisms seriously. So it seems like it's a pretty good place to work, and they are pretty good for the world, and they also make money. So Chouinard, if that's how you pronounce his name, I don't speak French, the head of the company, is a billionaire at this point, or the founder of the company is no longer the CEO. Patagonia has made a lot of money over the years. So one good question to ask when you encounter a company which seems to be doing things pretty well is, how do they do it? How do they pull it off? And I think there are a lot of different ways of telling the story, or a lot of different factors that you might point to, but a few things stand out. So one thing that's pretty clear is that they have a very clear role model at the top, Chouinard himself, who is the founder of the company and is, before he was in the company, or before he got into making gear for mountain climbers and outdoorsy people, he was himself a mountain climber who was an advocate for what they call clean climbing. It was for what they for climbing mountains without disturbing the face of the mountain by driving metal spikes into the face of the mountain. So Chouinard is sort of known as the real deal. He's been this real outdoorsy guy. He's clearly a guy that that customers, and one imagines many employees, sort of want to emulate them. That they want to model themselves after, that they want to imitate. He's a very rich guy with a big public platform and strong moral principles and a very good reputation. So there's a clear role model at the top, and both in his management practices, in terms of how he sets up paid sick leave, how he's managed the supply chain in the past, although he's not as involved in the day-to-day operations of the business anymore as he used to be, and in his sort of what Trevino and Nelson call his moral person, the sort of character that he projects, the moral virtues that he either exhibits or advertises, that sends a clear message. Okay. There is a lot of values communication within the business, not just coming from the executive leadership. So there's a lot of language of values. There's a lot of talk about the environment. They refer back to their values of care for the environment and not doing harm to the environment. There is, in a more kind of diffuse way that I think isn't just a matter of language, maybe it's also a matter of norms, maybe it's a matter of something else. There's a kind of shared understanding among people at the business that the business isn't just for profit, that it's a business which makes profit, they make a lot of money, but there's a sort of shared understanding among people who work for Patagonia that it's a business which is there to help the environment, that it's there to push government and push other corporate actors and I suppose in a way push consumers to make environmentally healthier choices. So there's a shared understanding of the business and a way of talking about what the business is up to, which appeals not just to profit, but to these moral values of concern for the environment and sustainability and so on. It's worth noting, I mean, this has come up already in a couple of connections, but it's worth noting that this is a very profitable business. And it's profitable because the moral behavior of the business it's charitable work, all these labor practices, it's supply chain. This kind of fits the brand of the business, right? The brand of Patagonia is this kind of responsible, rich, outdoorsy person, right? And so, that's the kind of way that they want customers to see themselves and to see themselves. And so the moral behavior of the business kind of fits the brand. It's not like it's software engineering company or a computer hardware company or something that does a bunch of environmental work, which is sort of besides the point. There's a close relationship between the moral behavior of the business and the kind of brand, the kind of image they want to project, the way that they market themselves, the way that they market their products. People sometimes put this in terms of authenticity, that they're the real deal. People can tell, consumers can tell, workers can tell, suppliers can tell, perhaps, when businesses are just talking good one, but they don't actually believe in the values that they're communicating or something like that. When BP, the petroleum company, puts the little green flower or whatever on their logo and talks about all the work that they're doing for climate change, I think most people can kind of see, oh, BP, weren't they the people behind that massive oil spill? BP is not, they don't really care. They don't really care about climate change. So there's some authenticity here, and it is perceived by consumers. So that helps keep the business profitable. I think it's worth pointing out that this is also a business that charges really high prices for its goods. Patagonia stuff is really expensive, and not every business in every industry, in every market, can work just like Patagonia. They are perhaps in a kind of niche in the market that enables them to do this stuff. It's not clear how Nike or something would make money or attract talent or otherwise improve their own financial situation by spending a lot of money on environmental activism and on these great labor practices. It's a business which is able to charge high prices, which operates in a certain niche market where the moral behavior and profit go together, but that same behavior and profit might not go together in other sorts of markets, in other sorts of retail environments. You might have to run a business differently if you're going to meet similar sorts of ethical standards. Okay. I think lastly, it's worth pointing out that, they're probably able to attract a lot of talent. So there are a lot of people who want to work for Patagonia because of its reputation and because of its labor practices. And, that you can make money that way. You can get the best people by getting a reputation for being a morally decent company and for having decent labor practices. Okay. So, Patagonia is able to succeed in its ethical culture, succeed in its ethical practices, in part because of a lot of the systems that Trevino and Nelson describe: executive leadership, role models, language, norms, but also in part because they occupy a certain sort of niche market where these practices happen to align particularly neatly with profit. Okay, there's our good example. There's our example of a kind of moral success, and it hopefully suggests some lessons about what's involved in running a business with a decent ethical culture, and perhaps how what's involved in running a business with a decent ethical culture varies from one market to the next, one industry to the next. Okay, what about a business that fails colossally? Okay, so you've seen the Enron documentary. Uh, by the time you're watching this, hopefully you're supposed to. If not, spoiler alert. Pause. Go watch the Enron documentary that I mailed to you. It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun to watch. And Enron was a company that had this massive historical corporate bankruptcy in the early 2000s, and is often sort of touted as a lesson of a company that just really culturally, top to bottom, just went completely wrong. So uh, it's worth taking a kind of inventory of what it got wrong, though, as a sort of list of don'ts. I think there is one of the themes that comes out of the documentary is that there's no accountability for failure, and there's a culture of enormous risk taking. So it's expected, it's a sort of a norm, that people will make very risky investments. So investing in, like video on demand before that was technologically possible, investing in, uh, Indian energy companies before the infrastructure was there. I mean, before the market was there, for that matter. And when these investments fail, when these risks fail, the people who attempted them are never held accountable. There's never any attempt to kind of learn your lessons. There's never any attempt to kind of symbolically demonstrate to other people that, like, okay, this is not a sort of risk that we want to take, and because this is what's going to happen to you if you take this risk, you're going to have to answer for it. Okay, so a combination of a sort of culture that prizes risk and that values risk in its norms and in its decision making and in its language, and also a culture that does not value accountability, that does not value taking responsibility for your own failures and presumably also for your own successes. Well, actually, I guess the people at the top take plenty of responsibility for their perceived successes. It's the problem is not taking responsibility for your failures. Okay. A lot of the problems at Enron revolve around their accounting practices. So it's super fraudulent in all sorts of ways. We could go into the details. One feature of the fraudulent accounting practices is what they call mark-to-market accounting. So where you can put profits on the books when they're just expected. So maybe you've invested in some firm and you expect, or in some new product, or bought some new patent or something, and you expect it to make $20 million for you for this quarter. Well, you can put those $20 million in your balance sheet, even if you haven't actually seen the money yet. So this is obviously an accounting practice which is super subjective. It's hard to imagine how this wouldn't be abused most of the time when it's used. This is really just it's just begging for dishonesty. It makes dishonesty convenient. It makes the bad choice convenient. There's also this sort of obscure financial structure within the business where they're able to Andy Fastow, who is the CFO, is able to set up a bunch of shell companies where he can hide Enron's debt. So the shell companies will lend Enron a bunch of money, and the shell companies will hold the debt. And so when the accountants come to look in, you say, hey, look, Enron has zero debt, but that's just because these like fake companies are holding all the debt that should be on Enron's books. And of course, Fastow is dealing money to himself in this whole process. In each of these transactions between the shell companies that he runs and Enron, he's skimming a little bit off the top, and he made something like $30 million over the course of his tenure there, just from these goofy deals. So these accounting practices are are practices where the bad choice is an easy one to make, and where there is sort of little effective oversight built into the practices themselves. Okay, there's when you look at sort of who's idolized in this firm, it's the people at the top, and there's this real kind of hard partying and sort of hyper masculine, like super macho kind of vibe at the firm, right? So everything is about competition, and risk and indulging your sort of enormous manly tastes, and so this is maybe there's nothing wrong with manliness, but there is something wrong with idolizing hyper competitiveness within a firm, idolizing having individual people take all of the credit for successes that are probably a product of the whole firm working together, and just living dangerously and recklessly, going out on your ATV and doing drugs, whatever. So okay, so these are the people who are held up as examples, not people who have, there's nothing wrong with using ATVs, and there's nothing wrong with taking drugs. I don't know, but if you want to hold people up as examples, people whose behavior you want imitated throughout the firm, those are probably not the features that come to mind immediately. You probably want, at a well-run firm, you want to hold up honest, maybe hardworking, maybe easy to get along with, cooperative people as examples. Okay. The performance review, the performance management system in Trevino and Nelson's terms is super, super punitive. They have the rank and yank system, right? So every year they fire 15% of their employees, and the employees have to rank each other, right? So that the lowest 15%, the people who fall in the lowest 15% of that ranking are automatically fired every year. And again, this contributes to the sense that even within the firm, it's nonstop competition. You can't trust anybody. Somebody's always trying to throw you under the bus. Somebody's always trying to make sure that you're ranked lower than them, because otherwise it's my neck. So hyper competitiveness within the firm, and a performance management system which encourages kind of people undercutting each other, people failing to cooperate with each other. Okay. In a lot of their dealings, especially in the California energy market, which was sort of newly deregulated in the late 90s, early 2000s, there's this kind of attitude towards government and in their relationship to the SEC, to the Securities and Exchange Commission, or to the other sort of financial regulators, and or even non-government accountants, Arthur Andersen. So they see all of these kind of external checks, regulatory agencies in California or at the federal level, or outside accounting, auditing firms. They see all these checks as sort of obstacles to be overcome or worked around or skirted around. So they're constantly looking for loopholes in regulations. They're constantly looking for opportunities to get one over on the SEC, or there's the meeting with the I think it's with some SEC people in Andy Fastow, right, where he's like kind of browbeating them or intimidating them. There's the sense that there's the documentary is called The Smartest Guys in the Room, and there's a sense that some of these people are just so smart that they just have to be able to outwit all of their regulators. So these regulators are sort of pesky, pencil neck twerps, and I'm too smart to deal with them. Okay. So this kind of attitude towards regulation is going to clearly pull you in the direction of criminal behavior, which is ultimately not going to be, in general, in the long-term interest of the firm. So, I mean, lastly, one thing that we might think about is, and this is a bit controversial, but what is Enron actually in the business of? Well, they have a bunch of different enterprises running, a bunch of different schemes going at any given time, but their core business is in energy trading, and the it's worth noting that they get, to whatever extent they can, they seem to want to get out of the actual business of buying and selling electricity and gasoline and natural gas and stuff like that. They want to get out of the business of actually buying and selling real commodities. They sell these sort of abstract financial products. And so at one point they start talking about trading on weather futures, that is, trading on bets about how the weather is going to change in the future. This is just like real, just casino bullshit, right? But like, it's a business which thinks of itself as kind of playing around with financial instruments rather than a business which thinks of itself as providing a real service or providing goods to certain customers. So this is, I think, a theme that you'll see in a lot of the case studies that you have, for example, that there's a kind of, there's often a underlying businesses that sort of fail spectacularly. There's a tendency to see the business as strictly concerned with profit or not concerned with providing any kind of meaningful service or good, but dealing with some abstract financial stuff. So it could be the case that in general, kind of financialization and the movement, especially among the upper management at a business, away from dealing with the material market in anything and towards dealing with sort of abstract financial instruments. I mean, it could be the case in general that this just encourages bad behavior. That the more financialized a business gets, the more people see themselves as playing around with money, the less they see themselves as trying to, actually like help people do stuff, help people keep the lights on, and so on. So, okay. So there are a few different features of what Enron got wrong that I think are, you might draw on in your own ethical culture projects, but also in thinking in thinking in your own careers. Ultimately, this is about what you do at work. I just want to close with a couple of points. There are a couple of ideas that don't fit neatly into Trevino and Nelson's framework, but I think are very important features of the ethical culture of a business, and they sort of cut across a bunch of different systems that Trevino and Nelson describe. And I think both of these are crucial to understanding both the Patagonia case and its successes and the Enron case and its failures. So these two ideas are accountability and transparency. Both of these are sort of buzzwords, I think. So maybe they're played out. Maybe I'm just buying up the hype too much, but I think these two ideas play a really important role in a lot of ethical successes and a lot of ethical failures of businesses. So what does accountability mean? Accountability means that people are held to account for their actions. They're held responsible for. They are called upon to explain their successes and their failures. They're rewarded for their successes, or at least they're given credit of some sort for their successes, and they're blamed or called on to explain their failures and respond to, maybe make some kind of actual substantive remedy to prevent those failures from happening again in the future. In Patagonia's case, we see its responsiveness to criticism. This is a real success of accountability. They see there's a problem with their cotton suppliers. They acknowledge it. They fix it. They see there's a problem with some of their wool suppliers. They acknowledge it. They fix it. Okay. And in the Enron case, it's really the exact opposite. Somebody blows $1 billion on some, really goofy, high-risk investment, and they get to keep their job. or in the case of Liu Pai, somebody who makes this, runs Enron's broadband business, which never gets off the ground, loses an enormous quantity of money for the firm, walks away with, the so-called golden parachute. He retires with something like a $300 million severance or something like that. Just crazy shit. So Patagonia, people and the company in general, at least, is held accountable for their failures. Enron, not so much. How about transparency? So transparency, the idea of transparency is a metaphor. The idea of a transparent surface is a surface that you can see through. And transparency is transparency in a business context means that information that is important for people to know is available when it's needed around the firm. That there are clear channels of communication that are open and that are regularly used, where people share the information that they need to share. This is partly a matter of norms that, people are expected to communicate about this, that, or the other. It might be a matter of the decision processes. It might be sort of on the books that you need to file some report in order to make some hire or decide whether to invest in something or whatever it is. It might be a matter of the authority structure. So might be somebody's job to broadcast certain information or package certain information, communicate it throughout a company, or to manage the transmission of information within a company. Okay, Patagonia, pretty good at transparency. They're public. In fact, transparency is not just like a safeguard against bad practices for them, but it actually helps them make money. They're able to broadcast their good labor practices and supply chain, their environmental activism, and so on. Within I think it's also worth pointing out that their business model is relatively clear. There's no secrets at Patagonia, as far as I know, about where the debt is stored. There are no shady shell companies that you're not supposed to know about that just lend money unaccountably to Patagonia to balance its books or whatever. Okay, so Enron, on the other hand, people are constantly withholding information from one another. The whole accounting structure is just built around lies and deception, both deceiving other people within the firm and deceiving investors and regulators. The financial relationship with all these shell companies where they store their debt is clearly not a transparent situation. So transparency and accountability are both features of a culture of a firm which kind of involve a bunch of different systems, in Trevino and Nelson's vocabulary, but I think are worth thinking about. You might ask yourself in your own case studies whether there's some failure of accountability or transparency, and perhaps ask yourself what systems are implicated in that. Okay, this one's relatively brief. Yeah, we'll pick up on Monday with the Sandel reading about what is not for sale. Okay, I'll see you then.